So, at the end of the last lecture, um, we presented the evil demon hypothesis, right? So the idea that there's this evil demon that's constantly deceiving me. And because this is a possibility, I can't be certain that I know anything, right? Because whenever I perceive something, it might be that the demon is tricking me, right? So, at the beginning of Meditation 2, Descartes asks, well, given that I am perhaps being deceived constantly, what exactly can I know? Quick sidebar, in case you hadn't picked up on it already, the evil demon hypothesis is a lot like, being in the Matrix or being in Inception, or being Inceptioned. So that idea that the things seem real, but I can doubt whether or not they are actually real, right? Okay, back on track. So given the possibility that everything I perceive is wrong, what can I know? Well, Descartes' conclusion, or what Descartes says is, I can know that I exist. How does he do that? Well, it's an argument that's come to be known as the cogito argument. That's C-O-G-I-T-O, cogito argument. He says the one thing he can know with certainty is that he exists, right? Cogito, Latin for I think, right? So he says, he begins with the observation that he's doubting, right? He says, well, currently I'm doubting, everything. But doubting is a kind of thinking, right? And thinking requires a thinker, right? There's no such thing as sort of like free-floating thinking, right? Thoughts don't just sort of float about the stratosphere and don't rattle, right? Thinking always requires a thinker. So, Descartes' doubting, which means he's thinking. Thinking requires a thinker. So, Descartes has to exist as a thinker. And if Descartes exists as a thinker, then Descartes exists. So again, to run through the argument, Descartes doubts. Doubting is a kind of thinking. Thinking requires a thinker. Descartes is a thinker. Descartes exists. So we have this, the expression that's worked its way into pop culture is cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. And it comes in that it's grounded in Descartes, right? He thinks, and because thinking requires a thinker, Descartes knows he exists as a thinker. Now, he says, I am a thinking thing. What is that? So he unhelpfully says, well, I'm a thinking thing. A thinking thing is a thing that thinks. You're like, thanks a lot, dude. That really helps me out. But then he says, well, what is this I, right? What am I? He says, am I a rational animal? He says, no, I'm not a rational animal because I don't know what rational is, and I don't know what an animal is, right? Again, we still have the hypothesis of this evil demon in play, right? So you could try to think hard about rationality, but, rationality is one of those really sticky topics in philosophy, and if we don't have to tackle it head on, well, we don't, because it's really fucking hard. He says, maybe I'm an animal. And he says, well, I don't know if there's anything outside of me, right? Because I know that I exist, and I'm hypothesizing this evil demon, but beyond that, I don't know what there is. So he says he's not an animal. He says, maybe I'm right. So in trying to figure out what he is, he then considers, well, maybe I'm just the mechanism of my body. That is to say, maybe there's nothing more to me than this fleshy hunk of mass that's right here. He says that can't be right, because living bodies share or have really, really, really similar parts to dead bodies, right? So if you imagine somebody just keeling over, they're going to have all the same vital organs that I do, right? So what I am can't just be my physical body, because I'm very different from a dead body, right? Dead bodies can't think, but I can think, so I can't just be my body. And so that's when he arrives at his whole "I am a thinking thing" bit. Right? He says, a thing that perceives, a thing that feels and imagines and does math and a whole bunch of junk like that. So what we're left with at the end of the cogito argument is that Descartes knows he exists and that he exists as a thinking thing. Now, we're going to see in the sixth meditation, which I'll talk about on Friday, that to be a thinking thing means to be a specific kind of a stuff, right? A specific sort of substance. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll address that on Friday. Now, the rest of the second meditation, Descartes occupies himself with thinking about a chunk of wax. And this part of the meditation has come to be known as the wax experiment. Now, we won't go through the whole thing, right? It's relatively straightforward to read. But the key thing to notice is this. Descartes considers the chunk of wax before it gets burned and after it gets burned. And he asks himself, well, I know that this is the same chunk of wax, right, before getting burned and after getting burned. But what is it that stays the same? Right? What persists throughout all these changes? And he says, well, I don't really know, but one thing that I know is common to both states of the wax is that it takes up room in space. Right? The word he uses is that it's extended. So his conclusion then is that the hallmark or the essential feature of physical bodies is that they take up room in space. So another way of thinking about it is that to imagine a physical body that does not take up room in space is a contradiction, right? I can't, for example, imagine a pencil with no mass, right? Or I can't imagine an eraser with no dimensions, right? Not occupying any dimensions in space. Right? To do so would just be a straightforward contradiction. So what are we left with at the end of Meditations 1 and 2? Well, in Meditation 1, we don't know anything, right? Or rather, more precisely, we don't know anything about the external world, right? About the world outside of me. What I do know is I know that I exist, and I'm pretty sure I know math, according to Descartes, though he sort of wobbles back and forth on that. So that's the end of the first meditation. At the end of the second meditation, I know I exist. Right? I know I exist because I think about my own, I sort of reflect on my own activities. And I know I'm doubting, and doubting means thinking, thinking means a thinker, right? Which means somebody existing. Additionally, we've learned that all physical objects are essentially extended. That is, they necessarily take up room in space. Right? An unextended physical object is just a contradiction for Descartes. Okay. Now, that brings us to the end of the sort of two main pieces, or I guess like 2.5, 3, what the hell, pieces of the meditations. So, there's one point that's gone unmentioned. It's a theme running throughout Descartes, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to highlight it, because it's doing a lot of crucial work for his position and for the arguments that he's running here. And so, what this is called it's called the conceivability possibility principle. So again, a claim that Descartes is leaning on, right? Something he's kind of assuming throughout all of this, is what he calls the conceivability possibility principle. Now, what the conceivability possibility principle says is conceivability is a reliable guide to possibility. So, if I can conceive of something, then it's possible. Now, an important point here is that we're using possible in a really, really broad sense. So the notion of possibility at work here is what's often called metaphysical or logical possibility. Right? So here are some things that are logically possible. It's logically possible that there is water in my cup. In fact, there is water in my cup. It's also logically possible that there's gin in my cup. Now, there isn't actually gin in my cup, but it's possible that there could be. It's possible that I'm actually not on the Gonzaga campus at all, that I'm actually in Kuala Lumpur. Right? It's logically possible for bloodthirsty kittens to fly through the air and to attack us when we least expect it. So that last one with the bloodthirsty kittens, not terribly likely, right? It's not going to happen. Nonetheless, it's possible. It could happen. So the hallmark of logical possibility is that the state of affairs you're imagining doesn't violate laws of logic, right? It's not internally inconsistent. So what's an example of something that's logically impossible? Well, it's logically impossible for my cup here to be white and black all over at the same time, right? That simply can't happen. It can be white in spots and black in spots. It could be white all over. It could be black all over. But it can't be white and black all over at the same time. Another logical impossibility. Married bachelors. Bachelors are by definition unmarried men. So there is no such thing as a married bachelor. Also, square circles. Right? A circle, by definition, is something without sides. Right? And a square, by definition, is something with 4 sides. So things that are logically impossible are things that, in a sense, are by definition impossible, or conceptually impossible. Right? You can't even imagine such a thing. So this idea, the conceivability possibility principle, is common to the to the first argument we considered with the evil demon hypothesis. It's going to come into play later in meditation 6. So how does the conceivability possibility principle work for the evil demon hypothesis? Well, what Descartes says is, I can conceive of an evil demon, right? I mean, we can all do this. If you've seen The Matrix or if you've seen Inception, then you can do it too, right? We can imagine ourselves being systematically deceived by something or other, right? Whether it's machines in a futuristic universe, or a mad scientist, or an evil demon, right? We can imagine ourselves being systematically deceived, right? Across the board. Because I can conceive of it, it's possible, right? Now again, much like our flying bloodthirsty kittens, it's terribly unlikely to happen, but nonetheless, it could. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves then is, since it's a possibility, since it could happen, is there anything on Earth that would rule that out as a possibility? That is to say, it's possible that we're being deceived right now, right? That right now you're actually hallucinating, that really you're just hooked up to a bunch of, to like some kind of supercomputer, right? You're just a brain in a vat with a bunch of wires hooked up to you, right? Or you're being inceptioned right now. Right? All these things are possible. So the question we want to ask is, what evidence would it take to show that that's not the case? That is, what evidence would it take to show you, to prove to you, that you aren't currently in the Matrix or the victim of an evil demon? And the answer is, well, there's none, right? Any evidence you might come up with that you're living in a real world is also explainable by the presence of an evil demon, or of some powerful supercomputer, or of a mad neuroscientist. So any evidence you could possibly come up with is explainable by one of these things. So right now, I'm holding up a little pink eraser. Right? So right now, I am perceiving an eraser. Right? I see it and I can feel it. Right? If I want to, I can even smell it. So what explains my perceptions? Well, 2 possibilities. One is that there really is an eraser here And this eraser, is causing my eraser perceptions, right? That's one. The other one is that there's an evil demon that's causing me to have these eraser perceptions. So we have two possibilities here, right? Two explanations for my eraser perceptions. One, an actual real eraser. Two, an evil demon causing me to hallucinate an eraser. Which one of those is right? And Descartes' insight here is to say there's no evidence you can come up with which would prove either one definitively right or wrong. So you might say something like, well, I've seen this eraser before, right? And so it's the same eraser I saw before. Evil demon just says, yeah, well, I was deceiving you then too. And you might say, well, other people can see it. Evil demon might say, well, I'm tricking them too. You might say, but I can bend it, right? I could gnaw on it if I really wanted to. Evil demon just says, more perceptions than I'm causing. So any evidence you might come up with that this eraser is a real thing existing in the real world is evidence in favor of an evil demon simply deceiving us across the board. So, Descartes' cogito argument tries to make a stand in the face of this and say, there's something I can know. The thing I can know is that I exist, and the evil demon can't trick me into thinking I don't exist, right? Because if the evil demon were to say, no, I'm tricking you into believing that you exist, well then, you still have to believe in order to exist. So, no matter how the evil demon might try, or no matter how, futuristic machines or mad neuroscientists might try, there's no convincing you that you don't exist. Because if you believe you don't exist, your belief has to be a belief by somebody, and the somebody doing the believing is you. So, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the third meditation, in which Descartes gives us an argument for God's existence. So we'll talk about why it's important that Descartes proves that God exists, and we'll just sketch out the argument. And we'll sketch out the argument in meditation.